Welcome to this masterclass explainer on Chapter 11. Look, if you're gearing up for your comprehensive final exam, you're in the exact right place. So let's just dive right into this. Today, we're setting the stage to explore the real, physical realities and the deep, deep complexities of the modern correctional system. We're going to look at how history, policy, and human behavior all kind of violently collide right inside the walls of our institutions.
I want you to kick things off by asking yourself this exact question. We really need to shift our mindset right now. Back in Chapter 10, we spent a whole lot of time exploring the abstract philosophies of punishment, right? The why. Why do we punish people? Is it deterrence, retribution? But right now, I need you to focus on the concrete, physical reality of what actually happens when a society makes that ultimate, incredibly heavy decision to completely remove someone's freedom.
The biggest connection you need to make for your exam is this. The physical buildings of our prisons and jails, they are not just brick and mortar. They are quite literally our underlying philosophies brought to life in concrete and steel. Think about it. When society leans heavily into incapacitation and retribution, what do? We build these massive fortress-like structures designed purely to warehouse people. But when society believes in rehabilitation, we design open spaces that actually facilitate education and treatment. Every single cell block, every rec yard, and every security protocol is just a physical manifestation of what we fundamentally believe justice should look like.
Now, to understand where we are today, we absolutely have to look back. But please, do not just memorize this as a boring list of dates for your test. I want you to walk through this history as a series of well-intentioned experiments, frankly tremendous failures, and dramatic shifts in penal philosophy. Each one of these eras developed specifically to try and solve the glaring problems of the era right before it, and together they shaped the massive infrastructure we're still using today.
What's really fascinating here is how our earliest penal experiments completely contrast with one another. Back in the 1820s, we had the Pennsylvania system. The creators of this system honestly believed that if you placed an offender in total, absolute isolation and solitary confinement, they would engage in deep religious reflection and penance. Well, the reality was catastrophic mental devastation. It just broke people. So in response to that, the New York or Auburn system emerged. They brought in smaller cells and this concept of silent congregate labor, meaning inmates worked together side by side, but in absolute strict silence. And the Auburn system ultimately won out, not because it was incredibly humane, mind you, but because forced labor was highly efficient and incredibly financially beneficial for the institutions.
Let's see how this evolution builds into what would be an absolutely incredible essay topic for your final. Eventually, reformers woke up and realized that silent labor wasn't actually changing human behavior. So, enter the Reformatory era in 1876. This was a massive pendulum swing straight toward rehabilitation. We're talking the introduction of behavioral incentives, good time credits, individualized treatment plans, a real game changer. But fast forward to the 1900s, and society's patience had worn paper thin. That pendulum swung hard back the other way into the punishment era. This brought in a harsh, get-tough approach, massive prison expansion, and backbreaking labor on farms and plantations. And the critical takeaway you need to remember, that get-tough approach ultimately completely failed to curb crime, which forced the whole system to reconsider rehabilitation all over again.
And that historical foundation brings us directly to our modern infrastructure. You fundamentally must distinguish between jails and prisons. They are absolutely not the same thing, so don't mix them up on the exam. Jails are short-term local facilities. They're managed by city or county governments. They primarily hold people who are just awaiting trial, meaning, by the way, they haven't even been convicted of anything yet. Or they hold people serving short sentences, generally under 1 year. Because of this, jails face massive day-to-day management nightmares with a population that is constantly turning over. Prisons, on the other hand, are long-term state or federal facilities, and they are designed exclusively to house convicted offenders who are serving much longer sentences.
Now, within that prison category, we have a highly complex web of jurisdictions. State governments run state prisons, obviously, and the Bureau of Prisons manages federal facilities. We also have military prisons for armed forces personnel. But I really want to draw your attention to private prisons. As those get-tough policies caused prison populations to absolutely explode, state and federal facilities simply ran out of space. They were bursting at the seams, and this gave rise to the use of private corporate contractors. Because these facilities operate on competitive bidding practices, it creates a literal financial incentive to keep populations high, and researchers consistently note that this profit motive often leads to severe struggles with safety, security, and staff turnover.
So how on earth do we manage these massive populations once they're actually inside? Well, the system categorizes individuals by risk and restriction.
Minimum security allows the highest degree of movement, reserved for the lowest risk individuals. Medium security steps up the supervision, utilizing cells or dormitories. Maximum security significantly restricts movement, mostly for serious, violent offenses. And then we have supermax. I want you to really think about the human experience here for a second. This is the absolute highest custody level, reserved for the worst offenses, and it heavily utilizes 23-hour-a-day lockdowns and profound near-total solitary confinement.
But how does the system actually decide who goes to minimum and who goes to maximum? They don't just guess. They use formal risk assessment tools, and you absolutely need to understand the two main criteria they look at. First, we have static risk factors. These are things that are set in stone. They can never, ever change, like a person's age at their first arrest or their past criminal history. Dynamic risk factors, however, are criminogenic needs that the system can actually attempt to treat, things like drug addiction, peer associations, or a lack of education. Assessing these factors helps the institution decide whether to view the offender through a backward-looking retributive lens or a forward-looking rehabilitative one.
Okay, now we have to address the systemic challenges facing these institutions, and we need to start with a striking statistical reality. 10. The reality of modern corrections is heavily burdened by racial disproportionality. Black men in our society are 10 times more likely to face imprisonment than their white counterparts. This isn't just some abstract statistic. It is a direct, glaring reflection of how mass incarceration and those get-tough-on-crime policies have disproportionately impacted communities of color, literally shaping the demographic makeup of our correctional facilities today.
And the crucial point here is that those exact same mass incarceration policies lead directly to our next major crisis, severe overcrowding. This is a deadly, predictable cycle. We see unprecedented population expansion, which causes our physical facilities to far exceed their actual design capacity. And look, when you cram too many human beings into a tightly confined space, you get dramatically increased tension and rapidly diminished resources. It's a powder keg. And that inevitably breeds high rates of misconduct, violence, and even full-blown riots inside the walls.
And that incredibly harsh environment shatters a very common public myth. There's this widespread misconception that incarcerated people have all their basic needs comfortably met at the taxpayer's expense, right? You hear it all the time. But the reality is quite the opposite. Incarcerated individuals face staggering out-of-pocket financial costs for basic medical care, all while earning literal rock-bottom pennies for prison jobs. This dynamic frequently leads to the dangerous exacerbation of pre-existing physical and mental health conditions. It is definitely not a comfortable ride.
Because of these harsh realities, the courts have actually had to step in. It is a fundamental rule of criminal justice that constitutional protections survive past the prison gates. You leave your freedom at the door, but not your constitutional rights. You must know the 1976 landmark case Estelle v. Gamble for your exam. Grounded fundamentally in the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment, this case established that a prison's deliberate indifference to an incarcerated person's serious medical needs actually violates the Constitution. It's the perfect example of why the justice system must continuously evaluate fairness and humane treatment even long after conviction is secured.
But wait, what happens when that conviction shouldn't have been secured in the first place? We have to examine the data on wrongful convictions. Between 1989 and 2023, the criminal justice system incorrectly incarcerated innocent people over 3,400 times. Just let that number sink in for a second. Every single one of those numbers represents a profound procedural breakdown that completely deprived an innocent person of their liberty. So how does a system that is theoretically designed to seek the truth make 3,400 systemic errors? Well, it comes down to procedural errors and investigative breakdowns. We are talking about coerced false confessions, terrible eyewitness errors, flat-out perjury, official misconduct by police or prosecutors, and faulty forensic evidence. When you are writing your essays, make sure you can explain that wrongful convictions aren't just random flukes. They are the direct result of specific, identifiable procedural failures. All right, let's bring the whole shebang together for your final exam review. You need to know these concepts absolutely cold. Understand the historic evolution from the Pennsylvania system's crushing isolation to the Auburn system's congregate labor, right on through the Reformatory and punishment eras. You must fundamentally grasp the divide between local, short-term jails and long-term state or federal prisons. Know those 4 security levels inside and out. Be able to confidently explain the difference between static risk factors that can't ever change and dynamic risk factors that we can actually treat. And whatever you do, never forget Estelle v. Gamble and the constitutional rights of the incarcerated. I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought that ties the physical realities of this explainer right back to the philosophies we discussed earlier in your course.
Take a good, hard look at our massive prison infrastructure, our complex security classifications, and our severely crowded facilities. And ask yourself this: have our modern architectural solutions actually solved the philosophical problems of punishment? Or have we simply built concrete monuments to our own indecision about whether we actually want to punish, incapacitate, or rehabilitate? I want you to think deeply about that as you walk into your exam. Best of luck, you're going to do great, and keep questioning the system.